Naima always believed her marriage was a dream come true. Growing up in Lagos, she used to imagine a husband who would love her endlessly, protect her, and walk beside her through every storm. When she met Akin, she thought God had finally answered her prayers. He was charming, educated, successful, and most importantly, he adored her, or at least that was how it looked. Together, they became the kind of couple people pointed at with admiration. At weddings and family gatherings, they were praised as the perfect match, the ones who had it all: beauty, love, and success. On the outside, everything glittered. Their photos on social media were always flawless. Their laughter in public was the kind that made others envious, and their families proudly introduced them as an example of what marriage should be. But behind closed doors, Naima sometimes felt a quiet emptiness. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there were cracks she dared not name. The way Akin sometimes brushed off her feelings, the way his eyes seemed distant even when he was smiling at her. Small things that didn't fit the picture of perfection. Naima told herself she was overthinking. Every marriage had its ups and downs, she thought. Besides, people saw them as blessed, and she wanted to keep believing that. But late at night, as she lay next to her husband, a strange unease often crept into her chest. She couldn't explain it, yet her heart whispered what her mind refused to accept. Something was coming, and it would change everything. At first, the changes were small, so small that Naima almost convinced herself they didn't matter. Akin started coming home later than usual, blaming work or traffic. Lagos was always busy, she told herself, so maybe it was true. But then late nights turned into excuses that no longer sounded convincing. His phone became his closest companion, always in his hand, always with the screen tilted away from her. When it buzzed, he would step outside, lowering his voice, laughing softly at things Naima could never hear. She noticed the silence between them growing thicker. Once upon a time, Akin would ask about her day, tease her about the way she burned rice when she was distracted, or sit with her just to share little stories about work. Now he seemed distant, his mind somewhere else. When she tried to talk, he gave her short answers. Sometimes he didn't answer at all. She started to feel invisible in her own home, like she was living with a stranger who wore her husband's face. Naima began questioning herself. Was she no longer beautiful enough? Had she become boring? Maybe she wasn't doing enough to keep his attention. She would stare at the mirror longer than usual, adjusting her hair, trying new perfumes, cooking his favorite meals, hoping for even a flicker of the warmth they once had. But Akin hardly noticed. And when he did, his praise felt shallow, like words spoken out of habit rather than love. The hardest part was the pressure from outside. In her world, a woman was expected to endure, no matter what her marriage looked like behind closed doors. A good wife is patient, they said. A woman must protect her home. When Naima hinted at her worries to an older aunt, the reply was quick and sharp. Men will always be men. Just pray and keep your marriage together. Instead of comfort, Naima felt the weight of society pressing down on her shoulders. She was told that her silence was strength, that her suffering was proof of her loyalty. But inside, Naima was breaking. She smiled in public, posting cheerful photos, wearing her gelly with pride, playing the role of the perfect wife. Yet at night, when the house was quiet, she held back tears that no one ever saw. Her heart kept asking questions she was afraid to answer. Why did she feel like an outsider in her own life? Why did her husband's laughter sound sweeter on the phone than it did with her? It was like standing in front of a glass window. From the outside, everything looked clear and beautiful. But from her side, the cracks were spreading, thin at first, then slowly widening. Naima didn't know when the glass would shatter completely. All she knew was that the man she had once trusted with her heart was slipping away, piece by piece, and she was powerless to stop it. It didn't take long for whispers to become reality. The signs Naima had tried so hard to ignore finally revealed themselves in the most painful way. Akin was no longer hiding. The secret calls, the late nights, the sudden coldness. It all made sense when Naima heard the name for the first time. Zinhle, a wealthy South African businesswoman with power, beauty, and influence. And worst of all, Akin was flaunting her openly. At first, Naima couldn't believe it. Friends called her in hushed tones, voices filled with pity. I'm so sorry, Naima, but I saw him. He wasn't alone. Her relatives tried to comfort her, but their words often carried an edge of judgment. Men chase money, Maybe you should have done more. Sympathy and gossip blended together until Naima felt like she was suffocating in shame. In every gathering, she could feel the stares, the whispered questions. What will become of her now? The cruelest moment came when she saw it herself. One evening, while driving home from visiting her mother, Naima stopped at a popular restaurant in Victoria Island. She wasn't looking for anything, just a quiet meal alone to distract herself. And then her world collapsed. There he was, her husband, sitting at a corner table, his hand intertwined with Zinhle's. They laughed together, heads leaning close, eyes glowing with a joy he hadn't shown her in months. Naima froze. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened as if the air had been snatched away. She stood there, hidden behind a pillar, unable to move, watching the man who once swore eternal love, now looking at another woman, the way he used to look at her. Zinhle wore confidence like a crown, elegant dress, flawless makeup, laughter echoing like music. Akin looked proud beside her, as though he had found a prize. In that instant, Naima realized the truth she had been avoiding. She had been replaced. Tears blurred her vision, but she forced herself not to make a scene. She turned away quickly, her hands trembling as she clutched her bag. The drive home felt endless. Every memory of their so-called perfect marriage flashed before her eyes. The wedding vows, the whispered promises, the nights they dreamed about their future. Now all of it felt like a cruel joke. Back home, the silence was unbearable. She sat on the bed where Akin once held her, staring at the empty space beside her. The words she had heard from people replayed in her head. Endure it. Men will be men. Pray and forgive. But she couldn't silence the ache tearing her apart. For the first time, she admitted the truth to herself. Akin had chosen another woman, and not just any woman, but one he believed was more powerful, more worthy. The betrayal wasn't hidden anymore. It was out in the open, painted across the city in whispers and knowing glances. And Naima, the woman once seen as the perfect wife, was left behind to face the shame and heartbreak on her. After the truth about Akin and Zinhle came out, Naima's world turned cold. People looked at her with a mix of pity and curiosity, as though she was a tragic story they couldn't wait to discuss. In church, women whispered behind her back. At family gatherings, relatives sighed loudly, shaking their heads as if her life was already over. Some even dared to say it to her face. Your husband left you for a wealthy woman. What value do you have now? It was cruel, the way society measured a woman's worth by the man standing beside her. Overnight, Naima went from being praised as the perfect wife to being treated like she was invisible, a reminder of what no woman wanted to become. Friends who once envied her marriage now avoided her, as though her pain was contagious. Even her family wasn't kind. An uncle told her sharply, "Be grateful he married you at all. Do you think men like him stay loyal? You should have kept him happy." The blame was always placed on her shoulders, never on Akin's betrayal. At night, Naima would sit in her room, the silence pressing in from every corner. She remembered the little girl she used to be, the girl who ran barefoot on the streets of Lagos, who fought through hunger and hardship just to survive. That girl had dreamed of a better life, had promised herself she would never let the world crush her spirit. Yet here she was, broken and humiliated, being told she was finished. But in her heart something stirred. As the tears flowed, she began to remember her journey. She remembered how she had studied late into the night by candlelight because her family couldn't afford electricity. She remembered selling small items in the market as a teenager just to support her mother. She remembered walking under the hot sun, refusing to give up on herself even when the odds were stacked against her. Naima realized she had faced battles long before Akin came into her life. She had fought poverty. She had fought judgment. She had fought to create dignity where there was none. And each time she rose stronger. Why should this be different? Why should she let society decide her worth just because a man walked away? One evening, as she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she wiped her tears and whispered to herself, "You are not finished." It was a quiet declaration, but it carried the power of everything she had endured. She began to feel a spark of the strength she thought she had lost. Yes, the world thought her story was over. They thought she was ruined, discarded, forgotten. But deep inside, Naima knew something they didn't. Her value had never depended on Akin, and her life wasn't ending here. It was only beginning. The world thought Naima was finished, but they had no idea who she really was. Everyone saw her as just a wife, a beautiful woman whose only identity was tied to Akin. What no one knew was that behind her quiet smile and graceful presence, Naima had been building something far greater than the life her husband flaunted. Long before the betrayal, Naima had understood that love was never enough to secure a woman's future. She had seen her own mother suffer, begging for help when her father abandoned them with nothing. Naima promised herself she would never be powerless. While everyone thought she was busy being the perfect wife, she was quietly creating her own empire. It started small. During her early years of marriage, Naima used the money she saved from her bridal gifts and allowances to buy a small piece of land on the outskirts of Lagos. She didn't tell Akin. She didn't tell anyone. That land grew in value, and she sold it to buy more. From there, she moved into real estate, acquiring apartments and commercial spaces that steadily brought her income. Each deal she made was carefully hidden behind trusted lawyers and silent partnerships. When Akin thought she was just attending charity meetings or social luncheons, Naima was actually meeting investors, studying markets, and expanding her reach. She bought shares in companies across Nigeria, then later in South Africa and Dubai. She built relationships with international partners who respected her sharp mind and vision. Piece by piece, she carved out her independence until she was no longer just comfortable, she was powerful. The irony was sharp. The same man who left her for a wealthy woman never realized his own wife was wealthier than both of them combined. Zinhle had her flashy businesses, Akin had his pride, but Naima had something stronger: stability, strategy, and silent power. She didn't need to show off because her empire spoke for itself. At night, when society thought she was crying over her husband, she was reviewing contracts, signing deals, and watching her accounts grow. Her pain was real, but so was her determination. If Akin had looked closely, he might have noticed the confidence in her eyes, the way she never panicked about money, the way she carried herself with quiet assurance. But he was too distracted chasing someone else's glitter to see the gold standing beside him. Now, as Naima stood in her study, surrounded by files, deeds, and investment papers neatly organized, she allowed herself a small smile. She was no longer the naive girl who begged for love. She was the woman who had built herself from the ground up. The world believed she was broken, but in reality, she was untouchable. Naima didn't need Akin. She didn't need Zinhle's kind of showy wealth. She had built something bigger, something lasting. And soon, the same people who pitted her would witness a truth they were never prepared for. She was the real queen, and her throne had been waiting all along. Naima had spent weeks living in silence, letting people believe she was broken, letting gossip swirl around her name. But deep inside, she knew the time had come. She was done hiding. She was done allowing the world to see her as a victim. The same society that mocked her would soon watch her rise higher than they could imagine. Her decision came one morning as she stood on the balcony of her mansion. The city of Lagos stretched before. She thought of all the times she had swallowed her pain, all the nights she cried quietly into her pillow while Akin paraded around with Zinhle. Enough was enough. If they wanted a show, she would give them one, but not as the humiliated wife. She would appear as the woman she truly was: powerful, wealthy, and unstoppable. The transformation was not forced. It was natural. She already had the empire. Now she allowed herself to live in it fully. Naima began attending high-profile events in Lagos, stepping out of sleek black cars, dressed in elegance that turned heads. Reporters who once chased stories of her heartbreak now rushed to cover her success. She opened her private estate to charity galas, hosted business meetings in her glass-walled office overlooking the city, and signed million-dollar deals with partners from Dubai, London, and Cape Town. Everywhere she went, Naima carried herself with grace but also with a quiet fire. People whispered, "Is this the same woman Akin left?" Their disbelief only fueled her confidence. Soon, glossy magazines that once wrote about Zinhle's fashion now splashed Naima's image across their covers, calling her the silent queen who rose. The moment of shock came for Akin and Zinhle when they attended a luxury business conference in Johannesburg. They walked in hand, expecting to be the center of attention. But the room shifted when Naima arrived. She didn't just walk in, she owned the space. Powerful businessmen and politicians stood to greet her. Cameras flashed endlessly, and right behind her trailed a convoy of international partners who openly praised her brilliance. Akin froze. Zinhle's smile faltered. They realized in that instant that the woman they had discarded was standing on a pedestal far above them. The cars, the mansions, the wealth, none of it was borrowed, none of it was dependent on anyone else. It was hers. Naima didn't gloat, didn't even look their way at first. She had no need to. Her presence alone was enough to burn them with humiliation. But when her eyes finally met Akin's across the room, he looked away, unable to hold her gaze. The shame was heavy on his shoulders. Naima had risen from the ashes of betrayal, and she wasn't just surviving, she was shining brighter than ever. The woman once pitted by society had transformed into a symbol of power. And now, it was Akin and Zinhle's turn to feel small. Akin had always carried himself like a man above everyone else. He was the charming husband, the successful businessman, the man people envied. But after he left Naima for Zinhle, things began to change. At first, his friends supported him, congratulating him on his upgrade. But when Naima revealed her true power to the world, everything flipped. Suddenly, Akin wasn't admired anymore. He was mocked. People whispered behind his back, calling him the gold-digger husband who abandoned a queen for crumbs. His own family turned cold. Cousins who once praised him now avoided him. His brothers no longer invited him to gatherings. Even his mother, who had once supported his choices, scolded him in public. "You left a diamond for glass," she told him sharply. "You have shamed this family." Akin couldn't escape the judgment. Everywhere he went, he felt the sting of humiliation. The final blow came at a grand charity gala hosted in Lagos, an event that drew the city's wealthiest, most powerful people. Naima was the host, her name printed on every invitation, her face on the cover of the event brochure. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, filled with dignitaries, business leaders, celebrities, and the press. Cameras flashed nonstop, and all eyes were on her. Naima entered the hall with grace, wearing a gown that shimmered under the lights. She didn't need to announce herself. The energy of the room shifted the moment she walked in. People stood, clapping, some even cheering, as though a queen had arrived. She smiled softly, acknowledging the admiration but carrying herself with quiet strength. Akin and Zinhle had been invited too, but not as guests of honor, just faces in the crowd. The contrast was brutal. The press couldn't resist. Reporters whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. The wife he left versus the mistress he chose. Cameras captured side-by-side shots. Naima glowing like royalty, Zinhle forcing a smile, and Akin looking smaller than ever. The humiliation only grew worse as the night went on. Influential businessmen and politicians flocked to Naima, praising her vision and thanking her for her contributions. She gave a moving speech about empowering women and supporting children from poor backgrounds, and the crowd erupted in applause. Some stood on their feet, chanting her name. Meanwhile, Akin sat stiffly at his table, ignored by people who once greeted him warmly. Even his closest friends avoided eye contact, unwilling to be associated with his shame. Zinhle tried to act unfazed, but her face betrayed her anger as she watched Naima bask in glory. The most painful moment for Akin came when an old friend patted his shoulder and whispered, "You had the crown in your hands, and you threw it away." He had no reply. His throat tightened, his pride crumbled. That night, the whole city witnessed the truth. Naima was celebrated, loved, respected. Akin was ridiculed, abandoned, and left to carry the weight of his own choices. The man who once believed he owned the world now sat in the corner of a room ruled by the woman he betrayed. Zinhle had once walked through every room like she owned it. She was bold, confident, and wealthy, or at least that's what everyone believed. With Akin by her side, she enjoyed the spotlight, the admiration, the whispers of envy. But power built on shaky ground never lasts, and soon, the cracks in her empire began to show. It started with a few bad investments. She put money into risky ventures, chasing quick profits instead of stability. A scandal broke out in one of her companies when employees accused her of fraud and exploitation. At first, she tried to cover it up, throwing money at the problem, but the press wouldn't let go. Stories about her shady deals filled the headline. Investors grew nervous. Partners pulled out. Slowly, the empire she bragged about began to sink. Behind closed doors, Zinhle was panicking. Her luxury cars were still parked outside her mansion, but inside bills piled up. Loans she thought she could manage became heavy chains. The very people who used to flatter her now avoided her calls. And to make matters worse, Naima, quiet, calculating Naima, was there in the shadows, taking opportunities that slipped from Zinhle's hand. One of Zinhle's biggest projects was a real estate deal in Cape Town. It was supposed to save her reputation and prove she was still powerful. But just as the deal was about to close, another company swooped in with better terms and secured the contract. Zinhle was crushed when she found out that the company belonged to Naima. The woman she had mocked, the wife she had replaced, had just snatched the ground from under her feet without even raising her voice. The fall was fast and brutal. Zinhle's name, once associated with glamour, became a warning in business circles. Banks refused her loans. Former allies spread rumors about her arrogance and greed. She was no longer the queen in designer dresses. She was the woman whose empire had collapsed. Society, unforgiving as ever, turned her into a joke. The same people who once chased her for interviews now mocked her downfall. At parties, whispers followed her. She thought she could outshine Naima. Gossip blogs called her the fallen mistress, comparing her ruined state to Naima's unstoppable rise. Even Akin began to feel the sting of her failure. Without Zinhle's wealth, his own life became heavier. He had tied his fate to her riches, and now those riches had disappeared. The gold-digger husband was left clinging to a sinking ship. Zinhle, who once carried herself like royalty, found herself sitting alone, staring at the walls of a house she might soon lose. All her power, all her pride had turned to dust. And somewhere far above her struggles, Naima stood strong, untouched, her empire growing larger. The mistress who had laughed at Naima was now society's laughter. The queen she thought she was had been dethroned, and the world no longer bowed at her feet. Akin was not the same man anymore. The confident husband who once strutted through Lagos with pride now walked with his head bowed, his clothes less polished, his voice less steady. He had lost almost everything, his money, his status, his respect. The friends who once cheered him on were gone, and Zinhle, the woman he sacrificed his marriage for, had crumbled before his eyes. Alone and desperate, there was only one place left to go, back to Naima. One evening, Naima was sitting in her living room, sipping tea while reviewing documents for another international deal. The quiet hum of success filled the space. Her home was alive with staff moving gracefully, her businesses thriving, her phone buzzing with opportunities. She barely noticed when the doorbell rang, but when she opened the door, her breath caught. There he was. Akin. He looked smaller, almost unrecognizable. His once proud shoulders drooped, and his eyes carried a shame he could no longer hide. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then, with trembling lips, he whispered, "Naima, please forgive me." The words hung heavy in the air. He stepped inside, falling to his knees as though the weight of his regrets had finally crushed him. His voice broke as he continued, "I made a mistake. I thought I was choosing wealth, but I lost everything. I lost you. Please give me another chance." Naima's heart tightened, but not with longing. Instead, it was with the strength she had built through fire. She looked at the man who once abandoned her and felt no weakness, no urge to run back. Instead, she felt powerful. She walked closer, her heels clicking on the marble floor, and stood tall before him. "You chose her wealth over my heart," she said, her voice calm but sharp, every word piercing the silence. "But you never knew my worth." Akin's eyes filled with tears. He tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled it back, her chin raised. For years, she had begged for his love, tried to be enough, cried silently while he gave his attention elsewhere. Those days were gone. Now, she was not the abandoned wife. She was the woman he could never touch again. "You thought leaving me would break me," Naima continued, her tone unwavering. "But it only showed me who I really am. You left me for what you thought was gold, but it was dust. And now you see the truth. You threw away a diamond." Akin lowered his head, sobbing softly, unable to argue. The silence in the room was louder than any words. Naima turned away, her steps firm, her spirit unshaken. For the first time, she felt truly free. Akin could beg, he could cry, but he no longer had any place in her world. He was a chapter closed, and she was already writing a brighter story without him. Naima's life no longer carried the shadow of betrayal. The pain Akin caused had once felt unbearable, but now it had transformed into her greatest strength. She poured her energy into growing her empire, expanding her businesses across Africa and beyond. Every deal she signed, every partnership she formed, was another reminder that she had never needed anyone to define her. Her name became a symbol. Newspapers wrote about her not as the abandoned wife, but as the woman who built an empire from heartbreak. Young women looked up to her, drawing courage from her story. She spoke at conferences, sharing her journey with honesty, telling others that betrayal doesn't end a woman's life. It can be the beginning of her power. Her voice carried hope for those who once thought they were broken beyond repair. Naima's days were filled with purpose. She traveled, she created, she built. But she also laughed again, lived again, and allowed herself to enjoy the life she had worked so hard for. Her past no longer chained her. It fueled her rise. One evening, at a charity event she organized for underprivileged girls, the cameras followed her as she stood on stage, glowing in her elegance. She looked calm, radiant, untouchable. The crowd cheered her name, celebrating not just her wealth but her strength. As the spotlight lingered, the camera zoomed in on her smile, confident, serene, victorious. Her voice echoed in the hall, steady and unforgettable. "He left me for wealth, but he never knew I was the true queen."